yesterday's daf that ultimately, again, the akum doesn't want to compromise his own animal. Ravina comes along now and gives a different answer. Ravina Amar Lo Kasha. We will say the Mishnah and the Brayso are not a contradiction. Why? Halachatchila hadi even. They will say the Mishnah is talking about lechatchila. The lechatchila, one should not stable their animal with an akum. Lastly, as it says, you can't purchase a para aduma from an akum. Has nothing to do with the concern that the akum is violating the animal, but rather, again, has to deal with a different concern, which is what? The concern of Rabbi Yehuda. So, tell Rabbi Yehuda Rav, Hiniach aleihan ora shel sakin. Uda shel sakin, pasla. Well, so listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda is the name of Rav. That we both say the halacha is that by para aduma, the animal can never have worked. If the animal was worked, that's a psul by para aduma. So we'll say, for example, Rabbi Yehuda is the name of Rav, even if you just put some empty sacks on top of the back of the para aduma, they both say that is considered to be avoda, and therefore that'll passel the para aduma. Ube'egla, and also when it comes to an egla arufa, egla, remember again, is the decapitated calf, right? That ultimately again is brought if you find a dead body between two cities. So both say, so remember again, egla arufa, the Torah used lashon of asher lo Allah aleha ol. It did not carry a yoke. So be'egla arufa ube'egla ashem timshoch ba. We'll say an egla ultimately again is only disqualified when? Until ultimately it carries a yoke. So we'll say, so watch this. So the Gemara is suggesting over here that maybe the reason why Rabbi Eliezer says you can't purchase a para aduma from an akum is why? Because even a minimal amount of work disqualifies a para aduma, even just putting some empty sacks in the back. And what do you have to be concerned about? That the akum did this. Now again, even if an akum will say knows, listen, every good akum knows that if you got a para aduma over here, that's your retirement right there. We'll say that's it. You hit the jackpot. So therefore, again, he's going to be careful with this animal. So he knows, everybody knows, a para aduma can't work. But yet the akum assumes what's work, Rabbi will say. So work means plowing a field. Work means carrying a load. Putting a couple of empty 7-mile bags on the back of the para aduma is not going to do anything. But yet, the Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Rabbi will say that is enough to disqualify a para aduma. Rabbi Eliezer perhaps subscribes to this shita and therefore says that you cannot purchase a para aduma from an akum because again you have to be concerned that the akum did quote unquote work the animal even in this very minimal fashion. So the Gemara says, Mar Savar Chashinon. Rabbi Eliezer holds that we have to be choshesh that maybe the akum went ahead and put some empty sacks on the back of the para aduma. Umar Savar Lo Chashinon. But the Rabbana hold no, we're not choshesh. To which the Gemara says, Lo Sakadaitcha Mishum Necha Purta Lo Mafsid Tuva. And most of the Gemara says, no, it can't be. We're not going to say the akum is not foolish. The akum is not going to go ahead and take certain minimal benefits from the para aduma and risk the major loss. Now, as I say, for the little bit of benefit that he gets by putting the sacks on the back of the empty bags on the back of the para aduma, for that little bit of benefit, he's not going to be willing to what? To ultimately lose the great windfall of being able to sell the para aduma. Doesn't make sense, I will say. So therefore, again, we're not choshesh for that. So why don't we say the same thing over here? Hachanami leima mishum hana porta do mafsituva. We'll say if that's the case, then we should say the same thing by bestiality. So you shouldn't be choshesh that, meaning you should be able to purchase the para aduma from the akum. We'll say we were saying before, what's the potential issue? Then why does Rabbi Eliezer say that a Jew can't go ahead and purchase a para aduma from the akum? So we floated a couple of different ideas. They've all been dismissed, which leads us back to one place, which is bestiality. So we'll say, so now we just said before, right? All roads lead back to bestiality. So we'll say, so we just got finished saying the following. You just got finished telling me that even though Rabbi Eliezer might hold like Rav, who says that even putting a couple of empty bags on the back of the para aduma will disqualify it, I'm not choshesh that the akum's going to do that. Why not? Because for the little bit of benefit that he gets from placing the empty bags on the back of the para aduma, he's not going to be willing to lose out on the major financial windfall. So why don't they say something about bestiality? For the little bit of pleasure that he'll get from engaging in the carnal act with the animal, he's not going to be willing to go ahead and lose that incredible fortune from selling it. To which the Gemara gives a dramatically amazing answer. To which the Gemara says, Hasam Yitzro Tokfo. You can't make a rational argument when it comes to a Yetzer Hara. Right? The Yetzer Hara doesn't operate with rational logic. The Yetzer Hara works with the Yetzer Hara. So at the end of the day, where the Yetzer Hara kicks in, logical thought leaves the building. So when it comes to something like getting minimal benefit from placing some empty bags on the back of the paraduma, so that's what we'll say that we could say the Akum says at the end of the day it's not worth it. It's not worth it. The few moments of benefit that I get there and putting the empty bags on it is not worth the incredible loss. So we'll say and this, by the way, we don't need the Gemara to tell us this because this is the narrative of our lives. Hasam Yitzro Takfor will say. We do crazy things throughout the course of life because the Yetzer Hara gets a hold of me. And we all have nights like this. I look back and I say to myself, why did I do that? I mean, it's so illogical. It doesn't, I don't mean like bestiality. I mean like, let me clarify that. I'm getting some weird looks like this. I mean that at the end of the day, we've all made mistakes in life, non-bestiality mistakes, because we've fallen prey to the Yetzer Hara. And then I look back at that mistake and that misstep and I say to myself, you know what? I can't believe I did that. I know better than that. And I should have more self-control than that. And it was such a foolish mistake. First of all, very often we say, it wasn't even worth it. Like I thought I was going to get such pleasure, such lasting benefit, and I didn't. It was a few, whatever it is. But I say that I try to understand I try to understand rationally what just occurred? What did I just do? What behavior did I just engage in? And I can't make sense of it rationally. And I will say that's because it's not rational. It's not rational. That's the Gemara saying. Hasim Yitzra Takfo. When ultimately, again, as soon as the Yetzer Hara gets a hold of me, I will say, the problem is that my rational thought often is compromised, and it's the Yetzer Hara that drives me. I will say, that's what we were saying yesterday. That's why, again, we keep coming back to this idea that the Gemara says, whenever a person feels seized by the Yetzer Hara, the best thing a person could do, we spoke about a couple of things. Number one is to pause, not to act, to try to pause. Sometimes buying yourself a little bit of time neutralizes the intensity of the Yetzer Hara, but also to learn. To learn, even if a person just says, Vaydam Hashem Moshe Leimar, a person just says a pasuk. I always say, because the power of Torah is that Torah has the ability to restore logic. Torah has the ability to restore reason. Torah has the power to restore rational thought to otherwise irrational situations. So therefore, again, even though if the Ovid Kochavim goes in and engages in active bestiality, he will lose the ability to sell the paraduma. But I will say that's a logical argument for an illogical, for an emotional Yetzer Hara situation, and therefore you have to be choshesh v'dilma to chuli alma lo chashin l'revia. Let's take a step back and we'll say, maybe in general, we're not choshesh for revia. We'll say, in other words, that even Rabbi Eliezer, who says that you can't purchase a paraduma from an akum, is not saying it because of bestiality, but rather, again, he's saying it because something goes, we'll say the reason you can't purchase a paraduma from an akum has nothing to do with bestiality. Nothing to do with bestiality. Rather, again, what does it have to do with Rabbi? Kidetani Shila. Detani Shila. My time, Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer say that you can't purchase a paraduma from an akum? Because the pasuk says, "Daber al bnei Yisrael v'ikhu elecha." Also, because the pasuk says, "Beginning of Parshas Chukas, Daber al bnei Yisrael, speak to the Jewish people, v'ikhu elecha, and they will take for you a para aduma. Bnei Yisrael yakichu ve'in ovidei kochavim yakichu." So we'll say the way we darshan is, instead of reading it, yikhu is yakichu. Yakichu means it will be bought from. And therefore, again, Rabbi say Shila is saying the Gzeres HaKosev, Rabbi say, is that what? A paraduma can be purchased from Yisrael, but cannot be purchased from an akum. So Rabbi say, according to Shila over here, Rabbi Eliezer's entire position, Rabbi say, nothing to do with bestiality, Yetzer Hara, any of this stuff. Rather, it has to do with what? A pasuk. Gzeres HaKosev. Yikhu, yakichu, you can only purchase the paraduma from Yisrael. The Gemara says, here's the problem. Lo sagadaytcha diktani seifa. Gemara says, I don't think so. I'll tell you why. I don't believe ultimately again that this is the reason. So the Gemara says, diktani seifa V'chin haya Rabbi Eliezer posel v'chalar karbanos kulan. We'll say this is very interesting. The Brisa ends up saying that Rabbi Eliezer says, we'll say, so remember, Rabbi Eliezer holds that you cannot purchase a para aduma from an akum. Furthermore, Rabbi Eliezer says that you can't purchase an animal generally for karbanos from an akum. And if you want to say the reason Rabbi Eliezer says that you can't purchase a para aduma from an akum is because of what Sheila said. We'll say, what did Sheila just say? Yakichu, it's Xeris HaKasav, that you can't purchase a para aduma from an akum. So the Gemara says, so bishlama para ksibekicha ala kulhur karbanos kicha ksibu. So say, I don't understand. If that's the case, that it's about yakichu, then that is a word by paraduma. Both say that word doesn't appear by other karbanos. If that's the case, then what? Rabbi Eliezer should allow you to purchase other karbanos from an akum. V'dilma, both say last line chaf gimel amud aleph. V'dilma ad kan lo pligi rabbanan leid Rabbi Eliezer. Both say furthermore again. Maybe it's only here that the Rabbanan argue on Rabbi Eliezer. Ella amud beis. Ella bepara didameha yikarin. So we'll say maybe at the end of the day, the only reason the Rabbanan allow you in this, maybe it's only in the case of paraduma that the Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Eliezer. Remember again, the Rabbanan say that you may purchase, you are permitted to purchase a para aduma from an akum. And we'll say maybe it's only here, but not by other karbanos. Why would paraduma be different than other karbanos? So we'll say very simple, didameha yikarin. Right? I will say because the paraduma is very valuable. So because that, look at Rashi, ela paraduma didameha yikarin. We'll say first line chavkim along days, dichayish ovid kochavim lahefsid meruba v'kayif liyitzrei. We'll say, isn't this interesting? The Rabbanan will say what? The Rabbanan will say it's only in the case of paraduma, which is very expensive, very valuable. That what? We assume the Oved Kochavim will curb his carnal appetite, right? Will go ahead and curb his Yitzhara for bestiality because he wants to make himself a lot of money. Avashar karbanos module. But I will say when it comes to other karbanos, ultimately the Rabbanan will agree with Rabbi Eliezer that what? That you do have to be choshesh ultimately again for revere for bestiality, and therefore you cannot purchase other animals from Ovdei Kochavim for carbonic purposes. I will say, by the way, I just want to point something out. If you accept this approach, then the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan is a dramatic machlokas. So we'll say, what's the dramatic machlokas? Do we assume that the akum has the ability to curb his Zara? I will say that that's really what they're arguing about. Rabbi Eliezer will say, no. Rabbi Eliezer will say, takif yitzir. And I will say, by the way, this machlokes will have ripple effects, not just for an akum and bestiality, it's a fundamental yesodistic machlokes in Yetzer Hara. So Rabbi Eliezer will say that if we say that the akum has this appetite for bestiality, that's his Yetzer Hara, we do not assume that people can curb the Yetzer Hara, even when they stand to lose a lot of money if they succumb to that appetite. Incredible. And therefore Eliezer will say, you can't even purchase a para aduma from an akum because you must assume that he is given in to this Yetzer Hara. The Rabbanan then say, no, already people have a Yetzer Hara, but people, they're not like a Meshuggah L'davar. In other words, people have some level of self-control, even in the realm of Yetzer Hara. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Even in the realm of Yetzer Hara, and therefore what? Even when it comes to the akum and bestiality, the akum can't control himself, especially when he stands to make a lot of money. We'll say an incredible machlokes. To which the Gemara will say, second line, Chav Gimel Amud Aleph ve'elo. But what about Hodesanya? We'll say, what about the following discussion? The Sanya. Lochin mehen behema lekarban. We'll say, so look what the Brisa says. The Brisa explicitly says that you are permitted to go ahead and purchase animals from an akum for general carbonic use. So says the Gemara, money, whose opinion does this reflect? Lo Rabbi Eliezer v'lo Rabbanan. Ultimately, again, it's not Rabbi Eliezer, and it's not the Rabbanan. I will say it's neither of them. Remember again, Rabbi Eliezer ultimately says you can't purchase any animals from an akum, and have a concern that ultimately, again, for bestiality, that's number one. And ultimately, again, the Rabbanan, I will say, we just said before that what? We just said the Rabbanan hold that the only exception to purchasing a carbon from an akum, we'll say, is where? Paraduma. Why? Because since it's so valuable, where you assume that the akum is going to curb his appetite. But by other karbanos, Rabbi say you can't purchase on the akum because you have to assume the akum engaged in bestiality. So Rabbi say when the Brisa says that you can purchase other karbanos or other animals from an akum for the use for karbanos, it doesn't reflect the view of Rabbi Eliezer or the Rabbanon. To which the Gemara says, "Va'otanya behedya." Further, Rabbi, we have another explicit Brisa. What's the explicit Brisa? So the Gemara says the following: "My osivu lechavroy Rabbi Eliezer." We'll say, what did Rabbi Eliezer's friends, how do they respond to him? We'll say, Rabbi Eliezer's shita is that you cannot purchase a para aduma from an akum. So we'll say, so remember again, we're now suggesting that Rabbi Eliezer really holds you can't purchase any animals from an akum for carbonic purposes. So the Gemara now says, what did Rabbi Eliezer's friends respond back to? What did they retort to him? To which the Gemara says, the pasuk Rabbi quotes over here from Yeshayahu, "Kotzon kedar yikbetzulach ya'alu l'ratzon al mizbechi." So Rabbi say, what does the pasuk say? Literally, all of the sheep of Kedar will be gathered to you, and you will offer them up willingly on my mizbeach. Rabbi say, take a look at Rashi. It's 4 lines down from the top of Rashi, last wide line. Kotzon kedar. Kedar is Yishmael. So we'll say Kedar refers ultimately again to Yishmael. Uksiv ya'alu l'ratzon al mizbechi. And we'll say, what does the pasuk say when it's speaking about, again, the animals that come from Yishmael? It says they will be offered up willingly on my altar. Alma b'shar karbanos nami shari b'shapir itartzan romion le'el. So we'll say, listen to this. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see the pasuk in Yeshaya says that there'll come a time when you will gather up all of the sheep from Yishmael. What are you going to do with it? You'll offer it up as a carbon. So we'll say, ultimately, again, what do you see? You see that Lemaisa, again, there is an opinion that holds that what we'll say, that you can purchase carbonos from, we see differently. You see that there is an opinion which holds that Lemaisa, again, animals which come from an akum are in fact fit for carbonic use. So we'll say, therefore, we go back for just a moment, and we go back to what Rabbi Padas said originally. Remember, again, just keep in mind what we're trying to do over here. We're trying to go ahead and establish reconcile the Mishnah with the Brisa. The Mishnah said you can't stable an animal with an akum. Why not? Because of a chashash that ultimately, again, the akum will engage in bestiality. Yet the Brisa says that one is permitted to purchase an animal from an akum for carbonic purposes. Rabbi Padas said it's not a problem. 2 different opinions. I will say the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer holds in general you can't purchase a para aduma, or for that matter any other animal for carbonic purposes from an akum because of choshesh bestiality. The Mishnah reflects that view. The Brisa will say reflects the view of the Rabbanon. What does the Rabbanon hold? The Rabbanon hold that you can go ahead and purchase a para aduma as well as other animals for karbanos from an akum. Fine. So now the Gemara goes weiter, to which the Gemara says, Adkan lo pligi ela b'chashasha. We'll say up until now, right? This machlokes. We'll say now. Rashi points out milsa ba'apei nafshei kamar. We'll say there's a little bit of it, same topic, but a little bit of a new stream of conversation. Up until this point, the machlokes only centers around chashasha, whether there's a chashash that the oved kochavim goes ahead and violates the animal. Aval hechot devadai rava pasla. We'll say, but if we know for sure that the akum violated the animal, then of course speaking specifically about paraduma, the paraduma ultimately again will be possible. So Rashi points out, so we'll say in a case of paraduma, where we do not know, we did not see the Oved Kochavim engage in a act of bestiality, so Rabbi Eliezer will say, we're choshesh bestiality. The Rabbanan will say, we are not choshesh bestiality. We'll say, what do you see from here? Shema mina de para kachim is be'achi. We'll say, now one thing that this does teach us is what we'll say. The fact that bestiality will disqualify a para aduma, we'll say, tells us that what? That para aduma is considered to be kachim is be'ach. It's considered to be a carbon. We'll say, now understand, para aduma is unique because the essence of the para aduma, we'll say, the main avoda of the para aduma is what? is not what's offered on the Mizbeah. I mean, it's not a carbon on the Mizbeah, it's the ashes that are used to purify from Tumas Meis. So the Gemara just says, the fact that Rabbi Eliezer says that we're choshesh for revia, for bestiality, and that if the akum violated the animal, that would passel the para aduma, that tells us that para aduma is in fact a sacrificial item. It's kadshe mizbeach. Why? Di kadshe bedekabayis, because it was a para aduma was treated like bedekabayis. Remember, bedekabayis refers ultimately to what? To items that are owned by the Beis Hamikdash, but have a monetary sanctity, much more than a kedusha saguf, than a physical sanctity. Because the paradum was kadshe bedekabayis mimifsla baravia. We'll say that ultimately, again, bestiality would actually not disqualify. It's very interesting. Bestiality only what's the word? Not defiles. Disqualifies something. Thank you. Only disqualifies something that is a carbon, but not something ultimately, again, that is bedek habayis. So the fact that ultimately, can both say that if the akum violates the animal, it disqualifies the paraduma, tells you that paraduma is kadshe mizbeach. Because if it was kadshe bedek habayis, maybe if sabaravia. To which the Gemara says, no, it's different. Shiny para dechatas kari rachman. Both say paraduma is different. We'll say why? Because the Torah itself calls it a chatos. And the Torah itself calls it a chatos. So if that Torah calls it a chatos, tells us that what? That it is in the carbonic family. Elameato, if that's the case, we'll say that it's called the chatos, and therefore part of the carbonic family. Tipasel biyotse dofen. We'll say if that's the case, then what? Then we'll say the paraduma should be disqualified if it's born cesarean, right? If it's a C-section. We'll say, take a look at Rashi. Tipasel biyotse dofen. Tipasel l'shakros was actually very interesting halacha. That apparently, if an animal is not born through natural birth, but is born through C-section, so we'll say such an animal is disqualified as a carbon. Look at Rashi. Tipasel biyotse dofen. The psulu l'shar karbonos the sign. Yesharo kesef prat l'kloim. Always prat l'nidme. Ki yivoled prat l'yotse dofen. So I'll say, so the Torah uses the pasuk ultimately again of ki yivoled. Right? Ki yivoled. It will be born. And we'll say to teach us that only an animal that is born naturally is fit for carbonic use. Any animal, we'll say, that is born C-section, that is born through a cesarean, ultimately again called Yotze Dofen, ultimately again is puzzle. So now that you're telling me that a paraduma is called the Chatos, which puts it in the carbonic family, then ultimately again if it's a Yotze Dofen, it should be disqualified. Maybe you'll say, yes, indeed that is the case. Alama Tanya, bro, say if that's the case, then why does it say Alama Tanya, Hikdisha be Yotze Dofen, Psula? Rabbi Shmuel Machshir. We'll say if that's the case, then ultimately again, why does it say if you are makdish a para aduma, that ultimately again is yotze dofen? It's puzzle. Yet Rabbi Shimon says that it's kosher. So we'll say, how can Rabbi Shimon say that it's kosher if the para aduma is called the chatos? If it's called the chatos and it's part of the carbonic family, then if it's yotze dofen, it should be puzzle. V'chiti Rabbi Shimon latami d'amar yotze dofen vlad ma'al yuhu. We'll say, maybe we'll say this is Rabbi Shimon going according to his logic. Rabbi Shimon will say generally holds that whether child or animal born Yotze Dofen is considered to be a regular birth. Rabbi Yochanan, Mo Dahai Rabbi Shimon in Kodshim She'eno Kodesh. We'll say they can't because we have on record as saying Rabbi Shimon holds that by Karbanos, so we'll say the Yotze Dofen is not capable of achieving carbonic sanctity. Ella Shiny Para Hoyel Umum Posalba Dvar Erva Va'avoda Zara Nami Posaba. The Gemara says as follows: Paraduma is different. Paraduma is different. So we'll say, I'll tell you. Remember again, we're trying to figure out why is it that if the akum does engage in an act of bestiality with the paraduma, why is it disqualified? So the simplest answer would seem to be because it's like a carbon. Because it's like a carbon. The problem is if it's like a carbon, then you'd say dofen should passel it. But yet we see a sheet of Rabbi Shimon who says that if the paraduma is yotze dofen, it's still kosher. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. There's a different reason why bestiality will passel the paraduma. All right, both because since by paraduma we know that a mum, some type of blemish, does in fact disqualify it. Therefore, again, once a mum disqualifies it, then a divar erva, an act of immorality or idolatry, will also disqualify it. How do we know this connection? Because we will say the pasuk says as follows: Ki mashchasam bahem mum bam lo yiratzeh lochem. So we'll say ultimately again, this is talking about a carbon that comes from an akum. Pasuk says, you can't go ahead and offer it up. Why? Ki mashchasam bahem. Again, we're going to define what this means just well. Mashchasam bahem mum bam. We'll say, what does this mean? The turn of the Rabbi Shmuel, kol makom shneimar hashchasa, eno ela davar erva. We'll say, wherever the Torah uses the lashon of hashchasa, right, which we'll say means destructive, hashchasa, that always refers to a devar erva. Right, we'll say it always refers to some type of immorality. So the Gemara says, eno ela devar erva, va'avoda Zara. Devar erva, dichsev. We'll say, how do you know that hashchasa means devar erva? Dichsev, ki yesh chizko basar as darko. Because the pasuk says again by the Mabul, ki yesh chizko basar as darko, which also means literally again every living thing destroyed its way. Al aretz va'avoda Zara dichsev pen tashchisun v'asisun lechem pesel v'hapara nami hoilu mumposaba devar erva. Sorry, v'hapara nami hoil umumposaba devar erva v'avodas kochavim pasliba. We'll say, and therefore again we see this grouping. We see this grouping of mum, avodah zara, devar erva. So we'll say why? Because it's the same lashon of hashchasa that refers to all three of these things. Therefore, I will say they're grouped together. So therefore, again, since we know that by paraduma, a mum passes by the paraduma, therefore, what's the say? A dvar erva will also pass by the paraduma. What's the example of dvar erva? Will be the case of bestiality. So Gufra will say, let's go back for just a moment. Tani Shila. So remember again, one of the suggestions we had for Rabbi Eliezer's Svara. Rabbi Eliezer holds that what will say. Then Allah again, you cannot purchase a para aduma from an akum. Why not? Rabbi will say because Rabbi Eliezer has a gzeres hakosov yakichu. It can only be purchased from a Jew. So let's go back. Tani Shila. My time Rabbi Eliezer t'chsiv darbrel b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu b'nei Yisrael yakichu vein of the kucham yakichu elameata. We'll say we're using this logic. Darbrel el b'nei Yisrael v'yikchu li'truma. So we'll say, so maybe you'll say something about truma. What does the pasuk say by truma? Speak to the Jewish people, and they shall purchase, or they shall take from me a truma. Both say, it's about the construction of the Mishkan. Hachanami te b'nei Yisrael yakichu vein ovdei kochavim yakichu. Both say, are you going to tell me that it is only Jews who can contribute to the Beis Hamikdash, to the building of the Beis Hamikdash, or to the utensils, but ovdei kochavim cannot? V'chiteim hachanami. Maybe you'll say, yes, indeed. Only Jews could contribute to the Beis Hamikdash, but in Akom may not. I'll tell you, that's not true. But listen to this Maisa. So V'hamar Rav Yehuda Shmuel, Shalus Rabbi Lazar, yes Rabbi Lazar, Ad Heichon Kibud Avaim. We'll say, how far, to what lengths must one go to honor their parents? So we'll say, listen to this. And what does Rabbi Lazar say? Rabbi Lazar will say, brings a Maisa from an Akom. V'amar lahem, Tzu'u le'uma asa ovi kochavim echel avi ba'ashkelon. We'll say, I'll give you an example. We'll say, it's a famous Maisa. You want to see the extent of Kibbud Avayim? I'll show it to you. What's the extent? See what happened with a particular Akum in Ashkelon. Who was he? Dama ben Nesina. We'll say, what did Dama ben Nesina do? Pam Achas, Bikshomino Avanam La'efod. One time, the rabbis came to Dama ben Nesina, and they wanted to purchase from him so precious stones for the ephod, for the apron of the Kohen Gadol. And I will say, what happens? What happens? Top of Chav Dalit. So b'shishim rivo schar. We'll say literally again for 600,000 coins. So we'll say an astronomical sum. They wanted to pay Dama ben Nesina for the precious stones of the ephod. And what happens? Rav Kahana Masni b'shmonim rivo. Well, so Rav Kahana says 800,000 coins. Okay, a lot of money. Vayim avtichos munachos tachas merashosav shel aviv. And we'll say the keys to the safe were underneath the pillow of his father, and his father was sleeping, and ultimately again, Dama ben Nesina, I will say, would not wake his father. So we'll say, the Gemara brings down this Maisa as an example to the lengths, that will say, no one says what his father said when he woke up from the nap, right? So I will say it again, obviously the Gemara is talking about over here, the incredible lengths that one must go to for Kibbud Avayim. And Dama would not wake up his father. We'll say, but again, what's the point? The point over here is that the rabbis were ready to go ahead and what? The rabbis were ready to go ahead and purchase stones for the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol from an Akum. What do you see from here? That obviously an Akum is permitted to go ahead and contribute towards the collection, ultimately again, of the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here, even though the Torah uses the lashon of yikchu, when it comes to truma, right? When it comes to collections for the Beis Hamikdash. Nevertheless, what? You see that you could purchase, you could take from an akum as well. Maybe so too by para aduma rabosai, even though it says yikhu, at the end of the day, we were darshaning, it means yakichu, you can only purchase the para aduma from a Jew, and ultimately, again, not from an akum. But you see, maybe it's not true. To which the Gemara says, avnei shoham hifsika inyan. So we'll say, ultimately, again, the pasuk quotes Avnei Shoam over here, kind of violence. So we'll stop over here. We'll leave off with this question. We will, Emirat Hashem, pick up with how you reconcile the fact that they are ready to purchase the stones with the fact that it says Yikchu, which we're darshaning to mean purchase from Jews and not from Gentile, to be continued tomorrow.